Have you ever been told in a narcissistic relationship that you don't know how to communicate? This little trend, and it's not a little trend, it happens, but I've heard about this happening to people so many times recently. I'm like, oh, this is a video, because I keep hearing this repeatedly. It's narcissistic people telling the people in their relationships with or work with or whatever, you can't communicate, which, by the way, that's rich, right? In all of the scenarios I have encountered with people who are going through this, being told that they cannot communicate, it was literally like it came up 5 distinct times in a month. And they were all very different kinds of situations, different kinds of people, different kinds of relationships, in which the narcissistic person, and even these narcissistic people, they had a mix of different kinds of narcissistic features, though most of them tended to be more vulnerably narcissistic, more victimized and entitled, rejection sensitive, chronically aggrieved and malcontented, very variable empathy, that kind of, narcissism, right? All of the narcissistic folks in these scenarios seem to be going through a bit of a rough patch, some form of disappointment, job's not going the way they wanted, so it's adding to their grumpy factor. In all of the situations, though, the person in the relationship with the narcissistic person has been slowly getting it, has been slowly disengaging, not taking the bait as much. Now, all of them were taking the bait to some degree. They're still doing it a little, but in all cases, whether they were engaging a little or more, whether they were engaging or not, all of these people in these narcissistic relationships were pretty damn clear about what they were dealing with. They weren't thrilled about it, but they saw it. And they were trying to survive in these situations. Many of them could not get out of these relationships quickly. Now, I'm guessing this, but in all cases, were it not for practical situations like custody or shared work, business stuff, or other logistical stuff, all of them would be extremely happy and much, much better off if these relationships were not in their lives. In all of these cases, though, and these are people who were communicating quite clearly. They're people I've known a long time. I know they can communicate quite well. They communicate clearly to me. It's never been an issue. They communicate with this narcissistic person about all elements of life, schedules, things that need to be done, things that were already done. They were also great at communicating about asking how the narcissistic people, how things were going in their lives. They followed up on things that they were told by the narcissistic person. Now, these folks had long ago either given up on the narcissistic person caring about what was happening in their lives, and more recently have learned that in communicating with this narcissistic person, less is more. So they were realizing that it was actually better when they didn't share too much of what was happening in their own lives with the narcissistic person, because of the risk it would be weaponized. So, they would be limited in terms of saying who they were going to see, what they were doing at work, even a feeling they were having, a nice thing that might have happened during the day. They weren't sharing those things with these narcissistic people anymore because knowing it would all come back to bite them. Well, the narcissistic people didn't like that. They actually, bizarrely enough, even though they're not always listening, they do want all the details of your life. Not because they care, not because they want to hear, but it gives them sort of the ammunition to attack you, to be able to tell you what's wrong with you, or to critique it, or to explain your life to you, to tell you you're greedy or selfish, or don't account for their feelings, or you do whatever you want, or you don't care, or you're insensitive, or to tell you that you're crazy, or you don't know what you're doing, or that you aren't savvy, or they want to mansplain or splain, as it were. Just so happened in this particular group, because there's so few people, all of the narcissistic people were men. That's why I'm saying they mansplained. And they would give these long, meandering, mansplainy lectures on what they believed was the right thing to do. Nobody asked them to tell them, right? And the thing they were suggesting was foolish because, of course, these people were the experts of everything, right? So all these people in these relationships had been gradually pulling back a bit. They didn't share as many details about their lives, all the things, right? But none of these people who were caught in these narcissistic relationships were doing anything bad. They weren't lying. For example, they may have been going to see a friend or a family member that the narcissistic person was chronically critical of. So the person didn't tell the narcissistic person who they were going to see, or the narcissistic person will say, oh, once again, you're not working, just chit-chatting with your friend. Or these folks didn't share details of an upcoming exciting project at work because either A, it may not turn out the way they wanted, or they just didn't want it to be criticized. And they didn't want the narcissistic person to belittle them or belittle the project. These folks were not lying. At worst, these were sins of omission, but they just weren't sharing things to end up in go nowhere conversations. But in every single one of these cases, without exception, even when the people communicated very clearly, when they said what time they would be where, when they followed up with the narcissistic person, when they very specifically shared dates and times with them and offered essential information, they were still told, you don't know how to communicate. Every single case. Then I sat down and I really racked my brain, and I saw that this theme of narcissistic people accusing other people of not being able to communicate, it was really a thing. Now, it's interesting that they would make this accusation, which really does feel like projection and Darvo and gaslighting, sort of accusing you, right, of something that you aren't doing, but they are, right? Most narcissistic people suck at communication. That's a fact. They will share things when it's convenient for them, with little regard for the impact it has on you. Narcissistic people almost never take accountability. Narcissistic people blame you and other people. They don't know how to share emotions. They don't know how to share feelings. They're often distractible, so they tell you things they forgot, or they'll forget things you tell them. They'll hijack conversations and make them about themselves. They gaslight. None of this is good communication, folks. Okay? And these are pretty standard things with a narcissistic person. But when you combine that combination of the poor self-reflective capacity that is standard in narcissism and the self-righteousness of most narcissistic people, means that many narcissistic people believe that they have, I should say, a delusional amount of virtue and capacity, and that they are brilliant communicators, and that everyone around them is not, especially those closest to them. Narcissistic people will never admit it, but they really do expect other people to be mind readers. And so perhaps the only way to be viewed as a good communicator is to read their minds. Frankly, it is likely that to be viewed as a so-called good communicator in a narcissistic relationship is not only just to read their mind, but is to tell them what they want, precisely when they want, and nothing else. If you have been in a narcissistic relationship for long enough, I am aware that you have very likely over-communicated for a time, telling them only what they wanted to hear, avoided communicating things that they didn't. Then at times you would then also do it in writing. You would suggest complex Google Doc and Google Calendar systems so nothing got lost. You censored what you shared, you undershared, you overshared. You found that there was no communication tool that works. That's because nothing works. Once people get it or actually leave the narcissistic relationship, you may leave the relationship with this internalized sense that you are a bad communicator because nothing you shared ever got through, because you were called a bad communicator, because there was no way to say things without things going sideways. So maybe it's because you didn't know how to say things. The reason things kept going sideways is because there was no way to say things without things going sideways. That's the nature of the relationship. That's not because you are a bad communicator. But unfortunately, when we hear something enough about ourselves, we believe it. We believe we are a bad communicator or just a plain bad person. And healing from a narcissistic relationship is not only just a form of deprogramming, but a form of actually trying to become acquainted with ourselves again, or maybe for the first time. Now, it is ironic that the people who can't communicate, the narcissistic folks, accuse other people of being terrible communicators. And this trend does tend to pop up. The trend of being called a bad communicator actually starts to pop up more once you start figuring them out. Once you start disengaging, holding back, not always telling them what they wanted to hear, keeping them on a sort of a need-to-know basis, not sugarcoating the facts. That realization and putting that into practice, frankly, that's often what made you a bad communicator. The more clear and honest you are in a narcissistic relationship, the more that this assertion that you're a bad communicator will be thrown at you. The more you don't show your hand, the more you will be called a bad communicator. In a way, take being called a bad communicator as a sort of badge of honor. So once the narcissistic person in your life calls you a bad communicator, it may mean, in some cases, that you've actually started to figure them out and figured out how to be in a narcissistic relationship. But you just can't let them know that you did figure them out. Odds are you're a pretty damn good communicator, but if you have gotten this accusation that you are a bad communicator, drop it in the comments. You're going to see you're not alone. Thanks again.